You're listening to WCOM LP 103.5 FM Carborough and Chapel Hill. It's a Tuesday, it's 5 o'clock, and that only means one thing. It's time for another round of Snarky Faith with your host, Stuart Deloney. This is a space where we irreverently wrestle through life, culture, and spirituality, all with our heads in the clouds, our tongues in our cheeks, our hearts in our sleeves, and our feet on the ground. At Snarky Faith, the questions or even the answers are never the point. It's all about the conversation. So here's your host, Stuart Deloney.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to another round of Snarky Faith Radio. I'm your host, Stuart Deloney, and welcome here again to Snarky Faith. Come in. Come on in. Come on inside. Pull up a chair. Hang out. We're going to have an interesting hour here ahead of us. And I'm going to go ahead and just kind of begin our little preface here, kind of giving you a little bit of a snapshot into my headspace and to what is really swirling around the idea behind what we're going to be doing for this hour on the show. So we are kind of living in a bit of a place of uncertainty in life, aren't we here, American folk and beyond? Well, I mean, on one layer of uncertainty, we're living in a place where we have a new president that's going to be elected later this year. Uncertainty. We don't know how that's going to happen. We also are living in a time of the coronavirus, where people are living in fear and not really knowing what is going on. For me personally, I'm also living in a stage where my 18-year-old is waiting to hear back from a college. So I am dealing in the business of uncertainty lately. I think like many others out there that we kind of feel like we're in a place where things feel uncertain, they feel nerve-wracking, and it really kind of feels like we want to be able to find a place where we can say we're gonna be okay. Like we're all wanting someone to say, hey, shh, don't worry about it. It's all going to be okay. And I wish that person was me. And I'm going to we're going to do a little bit of group therapy today. Now, I call it group therapy. Hopefully it'll be therapy for you. It's definitely therapy for me because doing this radio show is cheaper than therapy. But I want to really be able to talk about like how we figure out where our footing is in this day and age. Like how we figure out where to stand, like what we stand for, what we believe in, and kind of where we're going. Because, you know, what I've, I guess, been feeling a lot right now is that, yeah, in this time of kind of uncertainty and, well, it makes me feel like this. It makes me feel like, actually reminds me of a story. And I remember, this has been many, many years ago, where this is back when I lived in the Pacific Northwest. And I remember it was the winter time, and we had taken our kids out to the coast, to the Washington State coast, which is beautiful and rugged country. And as they're there, they're kind of walking around. They have their winter coats on. So I have my 4 kids, but I have my 2 smaller ones. They're kind of doing their own thing, like the 2 smaller ones tend to do, and not really paying attention to stuff. And they had kind of wandered a little bit like too close. They're wearing boots, rubber boots. So they figured they could walk around, you know, in the water a little bit, but they'd strayed a little far and weren't paying attention to the way that the waves were coming in. And a larger wave all of a sudden kind of came in and knocked them just knocked them. And they were just rolling. And it was a lot more water than they had expected. And my wife and I are kind of sitting back going, like, oh no, as parents do. First of all, oh no, now I'm going to have a kid that's wet, and we've got to do a whole clothes change. That's awesome. But we did the whole oh no, too, because you also care about your children having trauma. But somehow as a parent, we naturally think about, crap, I'm going to have to like do an entire clothes change on 2 children more than we're worried about their trauma. Because also, I will note, the 2 younger ones were not comfortable swimmers at this time. So as this is happening, one of my youngers, I will not say which one it is, begins to just panic. Just go crazy panic. And, okay, fine, I'm going to go ahead and out him. And I remember watching my son do this, because the story is way better if I can use names. And I see Samuel, like, floundering in the ground and just freaking out. And he is just terrified out of his mind because he feels like he's drowning. This huge deluge is all around him. and he's floundering, and I can't I want to get to him quicker, but he's I don't know, I want to say he's like 20 yards away from me, and the only thing I can yell to him is this. All I have to do to him is say, Samuel, stand up. Because what he didn't realize was that he was in probably rolling around in less than a foot of water as the water was starting to recede. And he had just lost his bearings. He'd lost where he was going. He didn't know what was going on. And he needed someone to kind of yell at him, to kind of shake him out of where he was at. And I'm using that kind of analogy to kind of do this for a collective group thought of being able to be in a place of saying, okay, here's where we're at. Here's what we know. And sometimes our reality isn't the reality of what's going around and hitting us. And all of this kind of reminds me of a quote I'd read like 2 weeks ago. And I wrote it down because I've been pondering this. And this is a quote from Alexis Dauda. Alexis Dauda, Dauda. And it goes like this. There are 3 ways of living. Through reality, through imagination, and through another person. So 3 ways of living: through reality, through imagination, through another person. And I feel like a lot of times in life that we end up kind of vacillating through each of these. At different times, I feel like we live through reality, through imagination, and through other people. Hopefully, I feel like it's like a confluence of moving through those things. But we're kind of mired into this weird reality that I've been kind of pondering a little bit longer than everyone else has. Most of you have when in relation to living under the coronavirus, where we have people freaking out, we have people worried about stuff, and there's just a lot of weird uncertainty because you don't know. Oh, did I touch my face? Have I washed my hands recently? And it makes us feel really uncertain. And for me, I've been pondering this since mid to late January, because one of my side hustles that I do here, apart from this radio show, is as I'm an ESL teacher, and I teach anything from children to adults in mainland China, Taiwan, and Japan. And so I've been dialoguing with my students as all of this was unfolding, really before it was getting to the prominence where we're at here. And just the whole lockdown with the coronavirus with Wuhan, and then the rest of the provinces in China kind of following with it. And it's one of these weird times where it really calls everything into question. Like, as I've talked through with adult students, they'll talk about how it's given them time to really like appreciate their family, to spend time with family, and figure out how much that they need to be investing more in their family. I've heard that from certain adults. Certain children start to go, it's like a cabin fever that I've talked about, where they'll count laps they walk around their house because they've essentially been quarantined for over a month at this point. But when we have these times where we are forced to slow down. Sometimes we have them in like little micro times where someone may have an injury, or you may have a holiday, or you may get sick. Sometimes we're forced to stop or slow down. Those can be times where we are able to grab perspective. There's other times where we're like living this larger arc right now where the entire world is worried about everyone's cough or sneeze or breath. And it brings us to a place where it really just feels very, very uncertain. And I want to talk through stuff, and we're going to go in just kind of a little bit of a flowy manner today, as we go through this, because really what I want to center on talking about here is that oftentimes in times of uncertainty, we either grab for what is certain. We can also grab towards fear and paranoia. But I want to offer something a little bit different on this odd road that we're going to be going down today. And the odd road is simply this, is me kind of explaining my train of thought. And sometimes it can take weird circuitous manners of ping-ponging or diagonaling around. And I want to talk about why we need to have gratitude in the face of uncertainty. Because I oftentimes do the shopping for our family because I'm a very quick shopper, but I have also watched, even in the area, how people have gone crazy like it's going to be a blizzard to where there is no food in the grocery stores, there's no toilet paper, and everyone starts to freak out. We see the stock market freak out. We see, a lot of the world freaking out, where some people are saying, hey, this is a big nothing burger, and some people taking this very seriously. And it's really hard when we feel like the nature, like this collective kind of spirit of chaos as a culture, and it throws everyone and all their stuff off. And as I've kind of been pondering through stuff, and as I do, pondering through different topics and themes that we go through our show on a regular basis, I end up compiling lots of articles. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of make a really weird tangent, but we're going to make it work. And that odd tangent was I had picked up. I have probably different categories of articles I have. So there will be articles I save for the show where I'm just like, I want to sit and pick this apart and trash it. Other ones I find that are interesting, or other ones I find that are funny, and et cetera, et cetera. And this is one of those that I really wanted to kind of sit and pick apart and mock and make fun of, because it comes from the Gospel Coalition. Good old Calvinists are always fun to be able to push around. It comes in an article called Progressive Christianity, Even Shallower Than the Evangelical Faith I Left, by Ian Harbour. Okay, so essentially what this is, he's going through an article talking about the folly of deconstruction. And as I was going through this, because deconstruction also leads to uncertainty, and as I was going through the article, I had my snarky reading glasses on, and I was looking at it from the lens of being able to be like, pff, 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 arrogant prick. But there were times where I would also say, I can see where he's coming from here. And my biggest issue is I very much disagree with where he lands. I think walking through some of his story will kind of help us to talk about what to do in times of uncertainty. And as this article is going through, that Ian is really walking us through, is he's walking us through his story. And we're going to be talking about uncertainty and story a lot today. And so we're going to relate these all back in. So just kind of buckle up. It's going to feel like it's on a tangent, and hopefully it won't be. But as he begins to talk about through this article, he talks about like this Christian tradition that he grew up in and the faith that he had. And then he starts to talk about where he began to feel like there were holes. There were holes in the foundation of what he was believing. And he asked these great questions. I'll quote some of the questions that, of stuff that he found when he was wrestling and going through the internet. What about the contradictions and scientific inaccuracies in certain biblical scriptures? How have we struggled at passages where God commands Israel to slaughter their enemies and their enemies' children? How could a loving God condemn his beloved creation to eternal torment? And what about other religions? And on and on and on. And so he begins to talk about how all these questions began to build up and mountain him. And then how those questions began to transition over. And this is the part I really appreciated his honesty within this. So those questions, those theological questions, began to rise in him from the faith he'd been raised in. And then he begins to ask these other questions, like more political for what is happening in front of us. Like, why are our policies, like political policies, why do they seem to particularly disadvantage poor and marginalized communities? Why was it common in the church to see Christians degrade immigrants made in the image of God who are simply seeking a better life in my Texas town? And as important as abortion is, surely we're supposed to care for those suffering after birth as well, right? So he's talking through this time where I think that there's a lot of honest truth to this, that for a lot of folks that have begun to really kind of question their faith and wrestle through it and go through process of deconstruction and hopefully reconstruction, we go through these places where the faith that we grew up in, the faith that we were raised around, the talking points that we were taught don't always hold up in every situation. And I was reminded of that from my own past, to where I grew up in a conservative Christian home that was at church on Wednesdays and Sunday mornings and Sunday nights, and anytime else there were events there. We were very, very good Southern Baptist people. And I also remember being a person that Now, in this story was that the internet is really what began to change him, being open to other ideas. I had always had questions. I had questions that were really just shushed and that were told to like, no, 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 don't ask that, don't talk about that, don't think about that. And so for with me, I can begin to really connect within his story, and then he begins to talk about going through a process of deconstruction and how it was almost freeing to deconstruct, and then what where he gets to and where the douchinish gospel coalitionists kind of come back in is where he begins to talk about the error of his deconstructing ways. Now, on one level, I will absolutely give him to it. I feel like there are many of us out there, and I do this oftentimes, even on this radio show. I try not to, but I still do it, where we can become really awesome at deconstructing, but we can deconstruct so much that we have no clue how to reconstruct. Like we become great demolition artists. Like we become those people that can go to any service or listen to any argument and begin to see flaws in it and begin to tell everyone else why they're wrong. But, a lot of people just end there. And there have been times in my life where I've absolutely wanted to camp there. I've wanted to live there, to live my best life now in full on deconstructing critical mode because it is fun because you tear your stuff down, then you can tear everyone else's stuff down, and it's a big old mess. And it reminds me of like little children, how they like to build these like towers of blocks and then run through them and knock them all over. It's beautiful. It's great. But if that's where the story ends, we're really, 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 really just left with a big mess. And oftentimes when we go through these seasons of deconstruction, we end up being in a very vulnerable space. Because once we deconstruct, we find ourselves in a very uncertain time. We find ourselves in an uncertain place because we tore down certainty. And now that that's all done, we're very vulnerable. Now, we're very ideologically vulnerable, is what I'm really kind of speaking about here, to where we are very open to new ideas. We're open to new shiny toys that we want to run after. We're open to new theology or thought processes or philosophies. We want to kind of add stuff in there. And as we begin to do this, we start to kind of build stuff up again, whether we know it or not. And the article, and this is where I felt like he started to go wrong, and he started to get all Calvinist and judgy, because that's kind of where this article is coming from. Where I do think that he's very true as he begins to deconstruct, saying that, hey, that progressives love tearing stuff down, but they don't really like building them back up again. And here's where I want to say that I think it is very important that we work on reconstruction. And I say that because it's not simply just building stuff back up again, but the process of reconstruction is a process that actually begins to give us tools. It begins to teach us stuff about ourselves. Because oftentimes when we go through periods of deconstruction, like I mentioned earlier, like a lot of my deconstructive process was tearing down stuff from my childhood, tearing down stuff that I was taught, that I was raised around. These were bricks that were put into place that I didn't necessarily put there. Now, there's stuff that I may have built on top of it after certain foundations were put there, but they were someone else's work. And when we're in these places of uncertainty, it's an easy thing for us to do to discount our stories, to discount it and just say it's part of the rubble that we just deconstructed in our ideologies. But the things that we have to remember are our stories matter. So on this road, in this place of uncertainty, if you are looking for direction, if you're looking for what's next, if you're looking to rebuild, return to your story. Because I feel like it's really easy for us to go back into a place where we allow other people to go in and other people to create our foundations and our ideologies and our beliefs and our dogma all over again. So we initially deconstructed because someone else did this. And then we tear it down because we're like, I see flaws in this. This isn't fully me. I want to do something that actually speaks to me. And then we go into places where we allow others again to rebuild these things around us, which you may either find a place that you are happier, or you're going to find yourself going back to deconstruction mode again. And that happy place, if you found it, won't last long because it's not yours. So then still you're going to go searching for something else. So instead of being on that endless treadmill of kind of constantly seeking and searching for something, after deconstruction, why not begin to reconstruct? So, how do we reconstruct? That would be a bigger question. The bigger question would be how? Hey, Stuart, how do we reconstruct? Oh, I'm so glad you asked that question. You've come to the right place. Well, I'm going to end up telling you how I have worked on reconstruction. Now, by no means is this an exhaustive list. This is just my story. And I bring up my story because knowing your story and owning your story is something that is very essential for this time period, for this place where you are at. So we may find ourselves in a place of uncertainty when we have gone through some sort of deconstruction where the world doesn't make sense, right? So how do we find direction? How do we find how we begin to rebuild where we are at? Because if we are sitting in a place where we don't know where to go, where we're kind of surrounded in rubble and we're like, I don't know where to go anymore. I'm not really sure what to do. I want someone to do it for me. Usually it's kind of one of my first thoughts. Can't someone do this for me? But I really wouldn't want them to. So one of the first things that we need to be able to do in these places of uncertainty is we need to be able to begin to remind ourselves of what is true. Because many things happen. When we are in a place of uncertainty, we get very scared. We want to grab onto stuff. We're even willing to take cheap ideas or cheap things to cling to just because it helps us to float, because it gets tiring treading water. And we want something to hold onto. Well, in these places, what we're going to do is we're going to end up finding ourselves in a time where we have to look back. Because the best way to know where to go is to look back to where you've come from. All of this, all of our stories, and this is one of the things that I feel like I always harp going back to, is that one of the most powerful things that we can hold, that one of the most powerful things we can own is our own stories. I feel like we live in a culture that's full of social media, and we live in a time where we're always wanting to almost be someone else. Oh, I wish I had hair like him, or looked like her, or had this in my life, or had that in my life. And we kind of get into these places where we are not very full of gratitude. We're in a place where we assume if we had more, something else, were someone else, that would make things easier. But the sad part of that is that we end up living out someone else's story. And we run away from the authenticity of our own story. So when we are in times of uncertainty, if we're in times where we're not really sure what is going on and happening, we return. We return to our own stories. We return to the places that had made sense in the past. We return to the places that did give us life. And this can almost be, it feels like a spiritual exercise of really just being able to sit and to contemplate. Some people journal, some people pray, some people meditate, some people do all of the above. Some people talk with a good friend that asks good questions. But however you do it, we need to be able to move ourselves back to these places where we're able to look objectively back over our lives. And not using this as a time to either be cruel to yourself or to beat yourself up. Because also when we put on these type of glasses to look back to our past, we have to be very careful. Because oftentimes we can be cruel to our past selves as we look back to the past. We can be cruel because we have learned from mistakes. or in the past, we may have issues of guilt or shame or things that we don't like. And we tend to judge ourselves in the past based upon where we are standing now. And when you go to look to your past, be very kind. Because the younger part of yourself that you're looking back at didn't know what you know today, didn't have the confidence that you have today, didn't have the experience, didn't know all of that. I mean, I've learned this the hard way. I can be a complete, righteously beautiful asshole in current life, especially when I look back at myself. I used to run with the justification, and this is a good one. You guys may like this one. I used to say, in my head, I was allowed to be as critical as I was of other people as long as I'm that critical to myself. To me, that seemed like it was fair. And because of that, I was awful. I was awful to myself. I was awful to my decisions I'd made in the past, the person I'd come from. I would look down upon myself in the past. How did you believe this? Why would you have done this? And that's not fair. I've learned to be kind to my past self. Or how about maybe more accurately, I am learning to be kind to my past self. So in these places of contemplation, I just warn you, be kind to yourself. You didn't have the same knowledge, experience, support systems that you do now than you did in the past. You were a different person. And so when we look back to the past, looking at the past with kind and gracious eyes, begin to look at the places that you found truth, the places that you felt fed, the places that you felt alive, the places that you felt healthy and balanced and strong and stable. And look at those places and begin to think about, what was the truth I can pull from that situation? What did I pull from that? Because oftentimes, I think that we can make an easy mistake of thinking that life is just a bunch of disconnected situations and events that we move through in an otherwise chaotic existence. But if you can look back kindly to your past, you can begin to see a thread. Threads of what makes you you. Why you believe what you believe, why you're passionate about what you're passionate about, what drives you for where you're at. And you can begin to see that. And there's times where we need to be reminded of that. There's times where we need to be reminded of that because we've lost the plot. We've lost our plot in the present too. So this act of contemplation when we're in times of uncertainty is an incredibly healthy first step. So we look back through kindness and begin to see, where were those times where I felt the most alive? I feel like too often we like to run from our past. We like to run from our stories because there's things that we don't like about them. There's plenty of stuff I feel shame or I feel bad about in my past. Plenty of things that I don't want people to know, but I would like to, almost like in the whiteboard of my life, begin to just scrub it all off. Clean slate. Look at us. Look at they. That's me. Because that's kind of how we've social media'd ourselves. We've learned to put our best faces forward and shade the best parts of our lives and our aspects of who we are to the world. But those things are oftentimes really fake. So as we look back, think of what you were proud of. Think of those times where you overcame something, those times where you'd be like, dang, I was really good there. I totally showed up. I did something great there. Or those times where I was so moved by things. I have a new friend that I've been kind of having interesting conversations with lately, and as I've been talking with her, it's kind of become this weird therapy. So as you start to get to know people, especially when you meet people that are hey, I don't want to deal with just the normal bullshit. Let's just be honest and real. And as these conversations I've been having, it's been very cathartic for me too, because it's I remember she'd asked me where are times in your life that you've seen God show up? And it really kind of took me back, and it's been something I've been pondering well beyond the conversation that I had with my friend. And and as I begin to look back, as I begin to kind of harken back to those times where like where did I feel most connected? Where did I feel most myself, most balanced, most loved? And where did I see God showing up in those places in my life? I I can, through therapy and otherwise, I can say that I've had a dysfunctional past. I think I can say that. I mean, there's many of you out there that have probably had worse. There's many that haven't had worse. So yeah. When anytime you have a therapist described to you as having PTSD from your childhood, you've had your share of lumps, and we've all had our share of lumps. And there can be times where when I feel like things are uncertain, I begin to kind of play that blame game. I look to where I feel like I've been wronged, or if only this were to happen differently. And that's not the kind of thing that I'm calling for here when we harken back to our past. I'm looking for the things that were true, that were like real, that were like as I have another good friend that I love having conversations with that used to be co-host on the show, Ben. And Ben and I like to talk about music lyrics that we feel are very true. There's music that's good, it sounds great, and it's fun to listen to, but there's stuff that's like true that like cuts you. That you hit it and you're like, oh, that feels like the marrow of life, that kind of true. And so take that, like look for the marrow in your story. And I can think of times weird. When she'd asked me this question about where has God showed up in my life, I thought of weird times. I'll actually share some of these and it's weird because I feel like I'm being bizarrely vulnerable, and it's nothing. Because as we've talked in past shows, your story is very powerful. So, yeah, take it or leave it. But I'm trying to think of like the times in my life where God has shown up, and a lot of times it's quite snarky. Hence the show you're listening to. But part of my past story, I can think of like in my childhood, like, well, it's just three times where God showed up and it didn't really make sense, and I wasn't looking for it and I wasn't asking for it. And this is all probably preteen years. I'm going to run through here. So first one, and I've talked about this on the show before, but part of my story and my past, and part that I need to look through and own, is that when I was 3 years old, my sister was born, and she was severely handicapped. She was severely autistic, couldn't walk, couldn't talk, couldn't communicate, and my parents, again, I was in Southern Baptist land, handled it in two very different ways. My father leaned into the scriptures and just kept being a good Sunday school teacher and really just, this is God's will, this is what we do. My mother leaned into other parts of the scripture and said, God needs to heal my sister. That's how we're going to do. We're going to fix this. And so at a certain point in my life, I would also, I would be going to Southern Baptist Church several days of the week. And then other times I'd be taken to different tent revival meetings of the charismatic or Pentecostal flavor, where I was thrown into a very different environment, maybe you could put it, a very different way of thinking about things. And I was able to see in weird spots like God in both. But I actually remembered seeing God the most outside of what was happening. Meaning that the conservative Southern Baptists and their love of sin and pointing out sin, and their love of scripture, and their love of memorization, all these kind of really concrete things. I remember being able to somehow find God in spite of those things that were very hard and concrete. And then on the other side, where everything's very spirit-filled and everyone's fallen over in the spirit, and they've got gifts and all this kind of stuff, and it's kind of just like, the X-Men have gone wild in the church, and you can do this, you have all these spiritual gifts. I was able to also see the BS through all of that, to where church was performance. and church was preying on people's insecurities. Um, but the weird thing for me was that I would go to all of these places, but somehow, like, my comfort in God happened outside of that. It kind of happened in the cracks where stuff didn't really tend to make sense. Or um, I can remember where when if you grow up in a Baptist church, you are when you pray to accept Jesus as your Lord and Savior. The next step is baptism. You got to show the world what you believe, and the world is really just your church members. So yes, um, and I remember this because I was also a child that didn't also do what I was supposed to do, but I was set to be baptized for my new Christian faith Sunday night during the Sunday night service because the real Christians go Sunday morning and Sunday night. And I'd been goofing around with my friend all day long, and we'd been starting fires, not like arsonist fires, but like dumb kids, like lighting stuff on fire and seeing what happens. And in the process of us doing this, I had burned my hand decently. But I soon had to go home and prepare myself to go to church to be baptized. The burn hurt really bad, and I was trying to hide it from my parents, which they still don't really know about the story. So successfully hidden from them. If they listen to the show, okay, never mind. Keep going. So it's hurting. It's completely. I'm just trying to, as a kid, like act like it doesn't hurt and everything else. And I remember, our church was a nice Baptist church, and we had a heated baptismal. So you kind of hopped into it as like a hot tub. And my hand, I remember going through this process of kind of being like, "Hey God, like, yeah, this is a cool thing I'm wanting to do. I'm not really understanding why they're making me do this in front of all these people, but I was genuine in wanting this." And so I kind of go through, I get baptized, I come up, and for me, in a weird little way, my hand didn't hurt anymore. And I saw God show up in a weird little way like that for me, where I was like, okay, this is done. I've had other times where I felt the closest to God in the weirdest of times, to where years later from that, my sister had died, and when she had died, well, before she had died, they were rushing her to the hospital. So my mother went with my sister and left me at home. And it had been chaos because there'd been paramedics in the house, and it was all this crazy stuff. And I had to wait for my dad to come home from work to pick me up. And I remember it was like, it's hard to tell. It was like a 30 minutes to an hour. And I remember just kind of sitting there, not knowing, like, just trying to catch my breath and trying to figure out what was going on and what was happening, and what. And I remember, like, the weirdest, like, sense of just kind of peace coming over me as I kind of just sat there. I just remember sitting there, in my room, like against the wall, with like my hand, like my head in my hands, and like my elbows on my knees. And I remember having just the oddest sense of calm that made no sense. And for me, in those weird little small times, God was so real to me. Like, was God real to me when my pastor was trying to tell me about why my sister had died and how it was all part of God's plan? No, no, hell no. None of that made sense. But when I began to find that, I began to kind of like sit down and really think through this. And I do this from time to time, where I try to sit down and journal and think about those times where I see the continuity of things moving in my life, the good things, like where I felt like God showed up, where I felt like I I showed up, where I was like fully myself. So I begin to do that, and what ends up beginning to happen, at least for me, it's been one of these things where I've been able to kind of begin to get more clarity. And through those times, we are feeling like things are very uncertain, and we don't really know what's going on, or like where we're at right now. Coronavirus, everyone's scared, everyone's worried about breathing on anyone else. And it feels like, death is around the corner. I think it's important for us to let these times remind us of things, for these times to let us remind us of what's important, for these times to let us remind us of where we've been and what we've been through and what we've accomplished and what we've overcome. Because as you kind of begin to chart all of these things out, you begin to see more and more of yourself. So in times of uncertainty or in times of deconstruction, it's important for us to be able to take stock of where we've been through. And oftentimes when we take stock, it's not easy because it may involve us, well, like when I said earlier about wanting to be able to make sure that you were kind to yourself when you begin to look back. And I've had to go through processes of really being able to forgive myself for things I've been through in the past. Like if I did stupid stuff or I said stupid things like that too, when I begin to look back to the past, especially going like, oh, wait, but yes, you were raised in a weirdly dysfunctional family and things were not normal and things were odd and awkward. And yeah, you didn't have any help back then. Oh, right. What would I say? What would I say to my younger self if I was an adult giving that child advice? And for me, that's been a very formative and healing process. Because when we begin to look back to it, it gives us can give us a sense of accomplishment. It can give us a sense of who we are, and it can give us a sense of gratitude. Because I feel like that is also a vital component of finding your footing, finding your place, finding your foundation when you're in a place of insecurity, is being able to have that realm of gratitude. If we can look back and be kind to our stories, if we can look back and mine our stories, and when I say mine them, find the nuggets of goodness in them. Now, I'm not talking about nuggets of like, the good old days. When I was back, I was captain of the football team. And oh, those were no, not that. That's BS, good old days. Those are good old days that, well, I mean, maybe you felt really alive playing football. Sorry. Sorry to all the high school quarterbacks out there that I just offended. But look back to those times that felt real, that felt tangible, that felt true, that didn't feel fake, that felt where something was like honest. Those nuggets strung together become the continuity of your life. It begins to tell you where you have gone, where you have come from. It makes up your story. And the importance of us owning our story, it's everything. It's everything. Oftentimes we want to be able to like clean slate stuff. We want to be able to start over. And there may be times where we ideologically or physically start over in certain places or areas, but it's really important that we aren't people that run from our past and people that don't sugarcoat our past. Because the real process of deconstruction leads to reconstruction. And if we can go through the rubble of our lives, the things we've torn down and looked through, and find what was good, what was right, what felt truthful, what felt life-giving, you begin to let those be your tools of reconstruction. You got me here? See? So knowing who you are, knowing where you've come from, knowing what you're made of, knowing where God has touched you in your life, knowing where God has moved in your life, knowing those times that were actually true and not BS, all of that becomes the tools for you moving forward into the future. Now, every day, in a certain sense, we're moving forward. Every day, we are either tearing down things or rebuilding up things. Because, again, I don't think anyone ever goes through just one period of deconstruction and then rebuilds it and we're all good. I feel like there's a process of tearing down and rebuilding, tearing down and rebuilding, tearing down and rebuilding. And I don't know about you, but in times like this, where we are on alert because of the coronavirus, or times where I can think of back to times in my life where I have thrown my back out pretty amazingly to where my pain level was at like an 11 for long periods of time, where I began to say, oh, is life worth it? Because it hurts that much. Or times of sickness where I was in the hospital and I'm just like, it puts things into perspective. The thing that I mentioned earlier that I love what has happened through a lot of my students that live in Asian countries that they've used a lot of this coronavirus time as they've been on lockdown to reevaluate their lives. I've heard parents talk about how they're like, oh, we've played with our phones until we were tired. We've watched enough TV and movies until we were tired, and then we just started finding ways to have fun. And I feel like this whole thing can be a weird paradigm for life, for where we're at. Because if it's not, if it's not the coronavirus today, it's going to be a pandemic of this tomorrow, or it's going to be this bad thing happening, or the stock market crashes, or whatever else happening. Life happens, and life is hard, and life sucks at times. But I think what matters to us most is being able to find those areas of sweetness in life. And there's that quote I'd read earlier that's been ruminating kind of in my soul, that there are three ways of living: through reality, through imagination, and through other people. I would hope to be a person, with me personally, and I hope that for you as well too, is that we can be someone that learns to enjoy all of those. How do we engage with reality with a sense of imagination? How do I engage with reality through someone else's eyes? How do I engage with things through someone else's imagination? And we begin to look at life through the fullness of that. We begin to see that what we have come through. And guess what? I've had great parts of my past. I've had a lot of sucky stuff in my past. I imagine that you may be in the same place. And if you're in a place of depression, which I've been there too, many, 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 many years of that, you may say right now, with the depression speaking, but there's nothing good. There's nothing good. Well, here's what I will tell you. You've survived this long. You've survived this long. When I looked at my past, I'm also reminded of many times where I probably could or should have been dead. Places where I've come very close to losing my life in serious, actual ways. And I look back to those and say, I have gratitude that I'm still breathing. I have gratitude that I have another day to make good decisions or lousy decisions, but they're my decisions as I move forward. Because being able to look back in times of uncertainty should give us the strength that I don't care who you are, you have made it this far, and you are a survivor. I was watching a nature show with my wife the other day, and I love the way that she looks at things. And she's very expressive when she watches TV. She talks a lot, and she does a lot of screaming and yelling too. It is a wonderful experience, and it is very beautiful. It drives my kids crazy, but I think it's a glorious thing how expressive that she gets when she does this. And we were watching some nature documentary, and it was talking about like the plight of the sea turtles, and they were showing, it was on Netflix, and it was beautifully shot, but a great reminder of how harsh life and nature is, to where they were talking about just the very, like, you see all these, like, the turtles struggle, the mother turtles struggled to get there on the shore and lay those eggs, and then they, somehow the eggs survive, and they start making their perilous journey, but you've got to get through the sand to get to the water, and all these seagulls are picking them off. Boom, 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 boom. My wife is screaming. They finally get to the water. Yay. Oh, but other things are in the water. They're waiting to eat them. Oh, and life is hard, and there is carnage, and we're surrounded in this. And I'm reminded as my wife is screaming, no, as we're watching these cute little turtles try to make their way, and they're boom, 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 being picked off. To finally say that, oh, there's one or two or three that make it. And that is a sweet part of the story of life, that you have been those one or two or three that can make it, that have made it. I don't care how successful you are, you have made it this far. So pat yourself on the back. And you're living in a place where you have enough technology to be able to listen to either a radio show on the air or a podcast, depending upon how you're listening to this. So have gratitude for that. Because when we're able to be people that are grateful for what we have, we're able to take stock in it, take stock in where we've come from, and own it, and own our stories. and own where we're at, we're able to kind of march forward with knowing who we are better, to realizing that we should be grateful for every breath that we have. And those two things, knowing who we are and being grateful. And actually, I'll say this, the process, what we're talking about with contemplation, is also being awake and aware. So being able to be armed with these begins to cut through a lot of the fog of uncertainty. Now, because I have to ask you this question, because I've asked this question to my wife, who also likes to worry. I love her to death. But with things like the coronavirus, will us worrying about this change it? It won't. Okay. We're worrying about it potentially stress us out and weaken our immune system. Ha ha! Worry about that. No. I'm not saying being fools. I'm saying that we prepare, do the best we can with what we got. Remember who we are. Be grateful for what we have. And armed with those things, an uncertain future begins to look very different. The fog begins to clear a bit. It may not necessarily even give you answers, but it gives you a different perspective to be able to walk into this. It gives you a different perspective to be able to take a deep breath and go, I can do this. I'm not alone in this. Because the worst place we can be is alone and isolated. Because when we're alone and we're isolated, we tend to forget where we are. We tend to lose perspective and look at everything through catastrophic eyes. We get more emotional than we should be, and that we're not able to handle things well as they come to us. So why have I had an hour right now, or almost an hour of therapy that I'm walking you through? Well, I do this because I believe in you. Because I've had people tell me that, and it has made the biggest difference in my life sometimes. They've told me that they know me the best they can, and they believe in me. And I want to go ahead and tell you this. I believe in you, and I'm not saying this in a weird way. I'm not trying to be overly touchy-feely with this. But I believe that if we were to sit down and have a beer, have a coffee, and talk, and if you were to be honest and shared your story with me, I would be able to tell you that I believe in you. That you've made it through a lot of crap that was hard. That there were times where, yeah, you weren't your best self, but you kept going. And it is an accomplishment for you to be exactly where you stand right now. Is it exactly where you want to be right now? Oh, that's not the question I asked you. But it is an accomplishment that you are standing where you're at right now, that you've survived this. That maybe I can even say this. You've even survived yourself and your own bad decisions, and you're still standing where you're at right now. Well done. You've at least earned that. Because in times of uncertainty, we can either also become people that become more and more paranoid, people that doubt others because we're doubting ourselves. And the more that we can own who we are and own where we've been through, the better we can call out those amazing traits in other people. The better that we can see in other people. Because if I can see goodness in myself, then certainly, if I can somehow find it in myself, I can certainly see your goodness. And when we begin to walk out with gratitude that we've made it this far, and of gratitude that I can see the awesomeness in your story, we can begin to trust one another and help one another and make things better. Because I'm tired of stories in the news about death and dying, and I did not want to spend an entire show talking about making fun of people's responses to the coronavirus. I wanted to give you something that was a little different and something that you can kind of bite into. So rejoice in your story. Take time to mine your story. And when we're in times of uncertainty, learn the value of speaking positive truth to other people. Learn the value of levity. Learn the value of laughter. And do the best with what you've got right now. Because honestly, it's an old quote that continues to stick with me, is that the glory of God is a man fully alive. How about the glory of God is a person fully alive, awake and aware, and grateful for their next breath and looking forward to what's next. Because when we look to the future, everything is unknown. Otherwise, we're just fooling ourselves. So walk into this week with a grateful heart, owning who you are. And I will catch you guys again next week. I send you out with the holiest amount of grace and peace and snark. I'm out of here. Peace.
WCOM is listener-supported community radio, and Snarky Faith is only possible through our sponsors. Lumen, a spiritual community of seekers, sojourners, question askers, doubters, and skeptics, is a collective of fellow travelers that embrace the truth that all of life is sacred, hope is real, and tomorrow can be a better day than today. All are welcome. You can find more information at www.lumencommunities.com.